Hi, folks. I have, I think, a very interesting episode today. It was triggered by a speech by President Putin, and the episode looks at some amazing links between Russian oligarchy and the sort of Western globalists. And we've called this the Russia's fifth column. And as we always do, we're going to present evidence and a document trail. It won't be just conspiracy theory. This is, I think, for us certainly very interesting. We hope you find this interesting. And I think this is going to really explain a lot of the big picture context of what's going on in Ukraine, because we're beginning to understand it's far more complicated than a fight for democracy inside Ukraine. So this is the actual speech that President Putin gave yesterday. He goes through a number of issues, but essentially what he's calling out are the sort of uber wealthy Russians who have made extraordinary wealth in Russia but don't live in Russia. And he actually says he doesn't mean physically. In this screen grab, you can see that he's talking about sort of mentally. They don't share any sort of common history with Russia, no affinity with Russia, and actually they're far more interested in being in this sort of amorphous global elite. And these are the people who would in the UK be described as the citizens of nowhere. They have no affinity for the country in which they're living or working or were born. And this is what he's calling out as a sort of fifth column inside Russia. And what's as interesting as the actual speech itself, which I think for actually most normal folk, this will resonate with most normal people around the world. Certainly, I listened to it and understood exactly what he was talking about, and it made a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people inside Russia will say the same. But a kingpin globalist is not going to like this kind of speech. And this is Trilateral Commission Deputy Chairman Bilt, who writes this off as a rambling speech. And this is quite a sinister quote for coming from someone so powerful in this sort of global hierarchy. This will not end well. I'm not sure exactly what's meant by that, but that is kind of a sinister end of tweet, and that is much more important than some of the saber rattling you get from people like Lindsey Graham, who are also members of the system and are calling for Putin's assassination. But in many ways, this is more important because it's low key and coming from a very serious individual. But I want to explain why he made these comments and what they refer to. In part, this was a response. Again, many of the things that are said in Russia are quite often responses to something that's been done. And of course, the first step is always deleted from the Western narrative and just presented as sort of Putin going off the handle. And his speech was preceded by about a week and a half or so ago by a video that circulated, which is here, which is we tweeted out a while ago. You can click on it and listen to it. But this is from Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who was previously Russia's most wealthy individual. He owned a very significant share in a company called Yukos, which at peak valuation was almost $30 billion market cap. And his history is that he was arrested in October 2003, sentenced in 2005, and released in 2013. There is an outstanding charge against him in connection with the murder of Mayor Vladimir Petukhov, who was the mayor of Neftejugansk. But he is currently, as far as anyone is aware, or according to press coverings, he is in Switzerland at the moment, but possibly in the UK. And he still runs multiple foundations. Now, what was said in this video is essentially a call to arms for a group of individuals who he named, including a sort of World Economic Forum trustee, German Gref, but he mentioned other sort of liberal elite members inside Russia. And the basic message in quite a sort of gangster style was, you either declare yourselves now or you're against me. And it was a very strange and threatening message, but that was done about a week and a half ago, and I'm sure what we're seeing now is actually the gloves coming off on this citizens of nowhere versus sort of more conservative value leaders, and this is what we're seeing now. Now, in terms of the foundations that he runs, this is actually one of them, which is the Future of Russia Foundation, which is incorporated in the UK. Now, I was kind of amazed as someone who thought they knew quite a lot about Russia, that I hadn't been aware of this connection, that back in the early days, Lord Rothschild was appointed as a trustee of this foundation, along with Henry Kissinger and his Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And this would have been at the peak of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's rise and wealth creation. And what I'd always assumed is that, and the general story is that Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested effectively because he overstepped a domestic political mark where he challenged Putin in the open, and that was his downfall essentially. But looking at this whole new angle, which I hadn't been aware of, is that this gives him a very significant level of protection from the sort of Western globalist elite. And Henry Kissinger is without question the capo di tutti capi of the globalist elite. He is really the kingpin of this. I think he's the driver philosophically and politically and probably physically. He's a very, very important person. And the understanding is they're not going to come and spend time on the board of a relatively small foundation to hand out a few gifts and grants to opera singers and musicians for no good reason. So I think the way we look at this is an explicit link into that system, and the expectation presumably would be that Khodorkovsky would be the next president, and that looked quite likely around about 2004, and then he would be part of this sort of global network. And I think it's more than interesting that actually a few months after the appointment of these positions in autumn 2003, Khodorkovsky's business partner was arrested. So there's a very small window between these appointments and the initial unwinding of Yukos as a company. And somewhere about 13 months later, Khodorkovsky himself was arrested. And there's very little coverage of this. I've seen a couple of quirky articles about this, that Khodorkovsky was basically deep into the globalist structure and very well integrated into the power sort of elite in Washington, including through an advisory role with Carlyle. And I think as our fight sort of becomes clearer with Ukraine and Russia, there are a lot of questions about these links, because I think underneath it all, this is really what we're seeing, a clash of this sort of domestic Russian conservative value system and sort of integrated into this globalist network, the sort of Build Back Better Club. Now, an interesting element of that, of the work of the foundation, it's kind of, it's not very active right now, and it's not handing out a lot of money because of all the things that have happened. But one thing it does do, as an example, is supports the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council is a think tank which we covered on one of the earlier videos, but essentially it's funded by pretty well most of the world's largest defense contractors, and also very heavily funded by big oil. So here we've just circled Airbus, Saab North America, Northrop Grumman, and here is the Future of Russia Foundation. And they're very vociferous, and in our view they're warmongering. And I think it's very dangerous when you get the sort of Atlantic Council as a sort of neutral name think tank, and behind it you have essentially a sworn enemy of the Russian president, who is trying to take Russia into this globalist system, which is more or less the opposite of what President Putin wants. So you've got this group aligned with defense contractors and big oil. So obviously there's some quite bad conflicts of interest here, certainly for the defense industry, who profits from increased conflict. So this is kind of troubling, and this is not an unusual structure. We'll look at other think tanks that are also funded by the defense sector, along with one or other oligarchs who are, in the case of Khodorkovsky, strongly against President Putin. In the case of other oligarchs, it's not exactly clear. But in any event, these people have an agenda. We're not looking at a independent think tank without any baggage attached to it. This is a lot of baggage to be making policy advice and appearing on the media to do with Russia. They have agendas that come along with this funding. And another item that we've covered also in the past is not just this work through these think tanks, but actually Mikhail Khodorkovsky's number two, a guy called Mr. Temerko, is a very significant funder of the Conservative Party of the UK through various offshore companies that end up going through Ackwind into the Conservative Party. So there's another whole strand of this, which is Khodorkovsky affiliation, to some extent infiltrating UK politics, and there's more coverage on this, but this angle is missed. People seem to think that because it's from Russia, it's Putin-affiliated money, and Putin is somehow controlling the Conservative Party, whereas in actual fact the opposite is true. This is money affiliated with opponents of Putin, and in the case of Temerko, he is actually wanted for charges in Russia, and his extradition hearing was denied. So he is essentially a fugitive from the point of view of Russia. So the mainstream media coverage of this is completely wrong. It's not Putin having influence over conservatives. It's actually sort of more or less enemies of Putin having influence over conservatives, and in this case strongly affiliated with Mr. Khodorkovsky. We'll look a little bit at the wider picture I mentioned of all these think tanks. So this is a sort of a map. It's a schematic from a report of all the money from these defense contractors that goes into this multitude of think tanks. I'm not going to read them all, but this, as I mentioned before, creates the very bad conflict of interest that you're providing policy advice, but at the same time you're funded by organizations that will clearly benefit from increased tensions and increased military spending. And this is not a crazy conspiracy theory. President Eisenhower warned explicitly about this in 1961, that you have to be very careful of the military-industrial complex, and I think we've lost sight of that, because what you're seeing now is representatives from these various think tanks who, as I said, they have a neutral name. When someone comes up and says, I'm from the Atlantic Council, he doesn't come up and say, hey, I'm from an organization funded by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Grumman, and Airbus. He says, I'm from the Atlantic Council. So people listening to that will not appreciate the fact that that organization is funded by very significant defense contractors. So here we put it in the map that we, as consumers of these interviews, which are right now on 24/7, they need to be aware of who's bankrolling these organizations, or at least who's contributing significantly to their funding. It's naive to assume that there's no link, which is of course what they claim, but it's not realistic. And again, you're getting these. You're getting these combinations of pro-war kind of think tanks with defense contractors, plus an oligarch or two, or a former Ukrainian politician will pop up. And of course, then you have agendas coming into this, which are served by increasing tensions and pushing for war. And as I kind of hinted, our essential guess is that really what you're seeing in Russia and Ukraine is a clash of values, and I mean, wars can be opportunistic and it can be about money and land, but I think at this stage, there's not a land issue. Russia doesn't need land. It doesn't particularly need sort of money. There's no obvious strategic benefit from having bits of Ukraine. So I think what this is, in our view, is actually this clash of values. And this is a quote. It's just not a direct quote from Brock Chisholm, who was the first head of the World Health Organization, very closely affiliated with the Rockefellers of that time. But this is essentially what he said, that the point of what he was saying, to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. Now, if you look back, certainly, I mean, over many years, all of those things have been going on. There's been an attack on all of those elements of our lives, but particularly in the last 2 years on individualism. And this is where we get into the tyrannical nature of this world government. If you look at the vaccination, that went from being an individual decision, which it always had been. Informed consent was the sort of gold standard. Suddenly that went from informed consent to a coercion, and this is part of the removing individualism. There's no risk stratification. It's like, this is what you're going to do, and everyone's going to do it, regardless of whether you want to do it, regardless of prior infection, regardless of risk level. So this idea of collectivization is going on all the time, and you see that also even in mask wearing. Okay, it might be useless, but it shows some kind of collective spirit to be wearing it. And et cetera, et cetera. There's been a very significant breakdown in the ability of individuals to make their own decisions, and you're seeing a lot of chipping away at fundamental rights all the time and being replaced with, but if the common good says otherwise, then your individual rights are gone. And we can do other episodes on that, but that's quite a common theme right now, and it is about pulling power away from the individual and transferring it to the state. Family traditions has been going on a long time, and patriotism also, I think, to my mind, is being unwound now. We're seeing all these different flags and symbols and all kinds of things not related to the nation state. And I think it's undeniable, really, that religion has been under some kind of persecution, certainly in the last, again, 2 years. Now, what's happening with President Putin is he made a keynote speech a couple of months ago, I think it was October 2021, where he flatly refused all of these sort of neo-Marxist values. He basically said, we are doing family values, we are doing the nation state, we're celebrating history, we are pursuing conservative values. Now, having said that, we recognize that President Putin is not an ideal president, and Russia's not an ideal country. There's a lot of things that are far from perfect inside Russia, but this statement is true. You look at this, and Russia is actively working towards building up a sense of nation state, and at the same time he said, we are rejecting all of those sort of, I think they're called more or less woke, you can call them neo-Marxist tendencies that you see in the West right now. So there's a clash of values here, and he's said quite explicitly, we're not signing up to this sort of Davos build back better agenda. We're doing Russia things for Russia people, full stop. And that will obviously put him on a collision course with the globalists, including in terms of money. The sort of divvying up of the spoils inside Russia is within a tight group that does not include anymore a lot of those Davos interests. And why would we be concerned about the globalists' worldview? The problem with them is, as with everyone, that you sell a sort of fluffy sounding idea of diversity, circularity, environmental concerns, which actually on the outside sound really good, and you'd be crazy not to want to sign up to that. But we've done a few films about what this really means for you and me and for our families. And it is probably the most godless, tyrannical regime that you could ever imagine behind this fluffy words. And we warned about this years ago. But the more we get into what these people actually want, they will actually reduce you essentially to a sort of farmyard animal. They will have dominion over your thoughts, over your body, over your activities. They really have a top-down draconian plan for you and your life. And we've just picked out a couple of the films we've already made about this. One is about enhancement of DNA. It's called human augmentation. This is classic transhumanism. And the point here is that the government may make these decisions for you about augmentation and messing about with your DNA and requiring you to have implants. So there's no longer personal choice. Again, this is building on the vaccine mandates that this has got to be compulsory and it's got to be government decision making. And this one we call Welcome to Digital Hell. It's still a very good film if you hadn't seen it. It is about having to have implants and having your workflow and your rewards monitored by an external computer, no human-to-human interaction. And a more recent one is the net zero gulag, where I think people now are waking up. To achieve net zero, every single aspect of your life is going to be regulated. And it's not a joke about eating insects. That is part of the 6 carbon budget. There actually is a section on how can we get Westerners to eat insects more and reduce meat consumption. So this is the level of detail that these sort of globalists want to decide on your behalf and then impose on you. I find it really worrying. That's why I'm so strongly against these World Economic Forum groups, and trying to spend all of this time explaining how dangerous these agendas really are. So just coming back to Ukraine then, Ukraine was always understood as a stick to bash Russia with, and we've covered this in other films, but this is the 2019 Rand Corporation. Rand is another one of those very, very important, it's the most important think tank. But this is from their plan, and it's entitled Unbalancing Russia, and it goes through a whole sequence of options of sort of hybrid warfare, essentially, I think you could call it, without breaking into full-on war. And it was understood that supporting Ukraine militarily would be a drag on Russia, and they understood when they wrote this, but that there was a high risk because that process could blow up into full-scale war, which is what we're seeing now. So they understood that perfectly well, and they went ahead anyway. They went ahead with arming Ukraine, having CIA training Ukrainian people, certainly in the west of Ukraine, who are not the most pleasant guys by any stretch of the imagination, and of course pushing the NATO expansion agenda. And all of that was done in the knowledge that it would be a drain on Russia, but it was also done in the knowledge that that could explode and become a big conflict like we have now, and that would be a price, of course, that Ukraine has to pay. It won't be a price that the people in Washington have to pay. This is blood and treasure that will be paid by the Ukrainians while the globalists play their sort of four-dimensional chess games. Pretty cynical in my view, but that's what they've done. And just finishing up then, what we see again with this, much more so than COVID, is this enormous PSYOP operation to turn this individual from someone who 5 weeks ago was considered pretty corrupt. He was tangled up in the Pandora Papers. There were corruption charges against him by the previous president, some of which were validated. He'd already done some fairly undemocratic things with closing down some media outlets. So this was by far not a perfect president, but somehow in the magic of 4 or 5 weeks of the most intense PR you can ever hope to see, he's transformed into a hero and given standing ovations around the world. And I think, that is, to me, part of the message that this is a project. This whole thing is a project. It's a project to tangle up Russia into war. It's a project to get everybody on side, I would say, brainwashed in order to expand this conflict. There's very little effort made to resolve it. There's much more effort made to expand the scope of the conflict and to achieve regime change inside Russia. And I think that was always the point. What we've tried to lay out here is that this is about regime change inside Russia in order to bring it into these Davos type global structures. And I think if you fully understand what those Davos type global structures are really up to, you would be very much opposed to what they're doing. And this is part of the wide program of talking about climate change, of talking about cybersecurity, and talking about COVID, and using those things to justify essentially one world government. One world government will be completely unaccountable to anyone and will have the most amazing flow of financial resources going into it with very little stroke no real oversight and no democratic accountability. And what you're seeing now are those global structures now imposing their ideas onto national governments. And one of the big things going on now is the WHO treaty, which will essentially legalize this idea that the WHO can impose their will on all countries who are signed up to that treaty. So one world government's becoming very, very real right now. It's no longer sort of advisory documents coming down from Switzerland. It's essentially instructions coming down. So the mechanics of one world government are also being put together right now, along, as I said, with all of those tyrannical decisions to oppress the freedom of the individuals through mandates, monitoring, cutting off from bank accounts that we've seen, etc., etc. So that's really, I think, for us, the nature of the conflict. And I think that the documents we found today provides a very interesting window into the role of Mr. Hodorkovsky, who was the person that initiated that response from President Putin, saying, we do not want these oligarchs, these citizens of nowhere here, making money, extracting wealth, and then mentally being elsewhere, having no loyalty to the country. And we see them as a fifth column. And I would like to say I see those same people as a fifth column inside our own countries. They are engaged in their own projects. They don't really, I don't think, at the end of the day, care one damn about the future of the individual people within their various respective countries. So this fifth column that President Putin calls out is essentially exists everywhere. I'm very, very much opposed to what those people are doing. As I said, in those films, we've described the transhumanism, the sort of tyranny of net zero, the lack of informed consent for medical interventions. Those are all very, very worrying things that now we're seeing the digital ID coming up, which will basically, at the flick of a switch, you'll be cut off from banking and everything else. So, I think his speech made a lot of sense and will resonate with a lot of people if they really get to understand the very big forces that are actually behind this conflict. It's not about democracy in Ukraine. Unfortunately, these big power games, it's about power and money, and regardless of the sort of valid kind of agenda that you're presented, that's not really what this is about. If this was about peace and democracy in Ukraine, everybody would be for it, and there wouldn't be a war today. The war is about the imposition of this tyrannical one world government on Russia and Putin's opposition to that move. That's our view anyway. So hope you enjoyed this, and please share it, because I think there's some important insights here that you're not going to see elsewhere, and it's taken quite a bit of work to dig up all the documents. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye and good luck.